taser officer! You will be tasered! Put the knife down!
This is the X26 Taser. Firing barbs charged with 50,000 volts, it can incapacitate its target immediately. More and more police officers in the southeast are using them, but there's concern about whether they're being deployed appropriately, particularly against teenagers. Under the Freedom of Information Act, the Sunday Politics Southeast has learnt tasers were drawn or fired against under 18s more than 70 times in Kent and Surrey in the past 3 years. Teenagers as young as 16 have been tasered by police, and children aged just 14 and 15 have been threatened with tasers. Sussex police say they don't believe tasers were used against any teenagers since 2010. Tasers were introduced to be used by police only in extreme situations, but we've been given examples of them being used on teenagers who've been drunk and verbally abusive, some who've been self-harming, and one who was found trespassing on a railway line.
Attempting to evade officers? I mean, do you need to be tasered if you're evading an officer? It's hardly a life-threatening incident, is it?
Anti-taser campaigners we showed the information to were concerned.
We're not talking about a modern-day truncheon. We're talking about a 50,000 volt assault weapon. In America, the instances have been linked to 500 different deaths by the use of tasers. That's got to be a big concern. You're talking about young people here that are very vulnerable, that could be much more susceptible to the use of a 50,000 volt weapon against them.
Sophie Khan is the leading personal injury lawyer representing people who've been tasered in the southeast. She wants tougher regulation on the way the weapons are used.
I am surprised, slightly disappointed that the use is on children when the guidance clearly says that children are in a specific group where they are vulnerable because of the likelihood that they could have, they're highly likely to get a cardiac arrest following the use of taser on them, or having barb injuries to their head because of the taser being fired at them and they're shorter than the officer.
Kent police say tasers are safe and often effective against teenagers as a threat, so firing them is rare. But these new figures come just months after it was revealed that half of people tasered in Kent and almost half in Sussex were mentally ill.
They would draw the taser. The next stage would be to point the taser at the subject themselves.
Tasers used to only be issued to specially trained firearms officers, but now hundreds of regular police officers are carrying them when they respond to emergency calls in Kent and Surrey.
They then have the option to arc the taser, and then lastly would be a deployment of taser at that individual.
In Sussex, 164 non-firearms officers are now undergoing training.
It's a very strict or stringent 4-day training course, but the last bit is the really strong real-life scenarios that we put our officers through, put them under a significant amount of pressure.
But campaigners say that's not enough.
A trained firearms officer will be having training for months and months and months, and they'll be reassessed constantly. What we're looking at now is that a taser rollout, that goes out to people that may have only had 3 or 4 days training. And that means that you'll be looking at them using weapons against young people in inappropriate times, inappropriate circumstances. And that's got to be a big concern to everybody.
Police officers argue that tasers protect them and the public, and that they cause less harm than a baton, pepper spray or a gun. The Surrey Police Commissioner says he wants more officers to have them. And the police union, the Police Federation, wants every beat officer to carry one. But the wider use of tasers worries at least one Sussex MP.
There's a danger that people who haven't been subject to firearms training will use them more readily, and that in fact is not good policing, because the skill of a police officer, which they have in plenty, is to be able to calm a situation down without resorting to weapons. And the danger is if someone who's not trained in firearms uses such a weapon, that could exacerbate the situation, which can then get out of control.
As more tasers are issued to non-firearms officers, will the risk of them being used against young and vulnerable people increase? And could the use of such a powerful weapon eventually lead to someone being seriously injured?
Joining us now from our Reading studios, the Surrey Police and Crime Commissioner Kevin Hurley. Kevin Hurley, thank you so much for joining us. Hello. Is tasering a child ever justified?
Well, let's get that into perspective. We had to talk there about tasering a child, but most of it is talking about a teenager. Teenagers have boxed for England, they play rugby for England, they play football for England, they've won Olympic medals. When you're dealing with a very large, difficult, struggling, disordered teenager, they can hurt you a lot. They can also hurt themselves a lot. We ask our police officers, and this is what the public tell me, not one or two activists, but the electing public tell me, they want the police to keep them safe. Our police cannot keep us safe unless they have adequate equipment to do so.
Okay, so let's be clear about
if I can just finish.
No, I really do want to be clear about the circumstances then. When is it okay? So, for example, in our report there, we've heard about a 14-year-old girl in Surrey who was self-harming. Now, she was red-dotted by officers with tasers. Two 17-year-olds were drive-stunned in Surrey. Could you just describe for us, because drive-stunning is slightly different than what we saw in the film there. What happens when you drive-stun someone?
Right, red-dotting means... Let's talk... The alternative is, first of all, they could potentially be beaten repeatedly with a metal bar, sprayed with CS or pepper spray, requiring possible hospitalisation. The police officer might have to punch or kick them, or they can have a low ampage 50,000 volt shock, which after 5 seconds is all over.
It's curious, isn't it, that you've missed out another option, which is to try and reason with a 14-year-old child. But you completely avoided mentioning that.
No, please don't be silly. We all know that the obvious approach is to moderate and in a compassionate and dignified way try and talk the situation down. Please don't be silly. What we ideally want is a moderate approach which avoids the use of physical force. Should physical force be necessary, regardless on who or what it's being used on in terms of their age or background, we want to minimise injury to them, injury to the public and injury to police officers.
But we heard Sophie Khan there saying it was highly likely a child could suffer cardiac arrest. I'll point you also to Mind, the mental health charity, who say they're deeply concerned about these figures. They say tasers can cause extreme distress, so to use them on people who are experiencing a mental health crisis, and I would suggest that a child who's self-harming is in that position and already displaying signs of distress, can make things even more traumatic.
Please don't use emotional words like child. Let's stay with teenager, because that's clear.
Forgive me, a 14-year-old is a child. It's not an emotional word.
Okay.
It's a regular use of the English language.
Okay, we'll stay with your 14-year-old who's red-dotted. Red-dotted means that the taser is drawn and a red dot goes on their chest. And as a result of that, they think, oh, I don't want to do that. The alternative is the police officers have to physically wrestle them to the ground, punch them, assault them, control them in whatever way, probably far more injurious. I do wish people would stop being so naive about what is required to control a violent person regardless of their age. We want our police to protect us in a proportionate, reasonable, measured way.
So explain to me this. A violent crime in Surrey is down 26% year on year. Surrey has among the lowest levels of violent crime anywhere in the country. You're campaigning, or you're calling for more of your officers to have tasers. Wouldn't the evidence suggest the opposite?
No, because you completely missed the point I've said at the very beginning. Taser is the least injurious way of applying physical force to a human body.
But why do we always have to apply physical force? I mean, when we're talking about somebody who's seriously mentally ill...
Let me answer your question again. I said at the beginning, we want a moderate, measured approach. Negotiation is always best. But there comes a time when you have to apply physical force.
Are you worried by the possibility of a death in Surrey? In America, 500 deaths have been linked with tasers. People who take antipsychotic medication are vulnerable to fatal injury. People who've been tasered could also... Well, let me just make the other points. As well as the risk of death, people can experience post-traumatic stress disorder, convulsions, miscarriage, and psychological effects.
Can I answer?
You may, absolutely.
Please. Right, of course I'm worried about the risk of death and serious injury, which is why I'd like to see more taser introduced, because it reduces the risk of death or serious injury.
You're only giving your officers 3 days training to use something that you admit you're worried about the risk of death with.
Can I finish my point? It is the least injurious way of delivering force and gaining compliance. Most people surrender when a taser is drawn. You don't need to strike them with a baton, you don't need to punch them, you don't need to spray them. They generally give up. If they're tasered, they fall over, they're handcuffed and it's all over. If they're struck with a baton, they generally require further medical treatment. I wish to reduce the injuries to the public, teenagers, children if you like, who are causing problems on our streets. Taser is the least injurious form of delivery.
I think we've taken that point repeatedly. Kevin Hurley, thank you very much indeed. Let's put some of those points to our guests of the day now. Tracy, we heard there violent crime is down in Surrey. Kent has lower violent crime than other parts of the country. The head of the Kent Police Federation, Ian Poynton, clearly would like all police officers to be issued with tasers. Would you welcome that?
No, I don't. I think tasers are incredibly important within the overall police operations, but I don't see the need for all police officers to have tasers in the same way that I don't see the need for police officers to have guns.
Do you think they should be tasering children?
I think that it's very difficult when a police officer arrives at a situation. They have to judge that situation as it is presented to them. Quite often, children as young as 14 could be self-harming. A taser is actually designed to incapacitate that person so that an officer can deal with them. Obviously, I would prefer to see them try and talk to that person first.
Interesting, though, isn't it, that Mind, the mental health charity, clearly thinks that is the wrong way to tackle it. Let's just bring Vince in on this one. Half of the tasers used in the last year in Kent were on people who were mentally ill. Does that worry you?
I mean, that gives me great cause for concern. Something like a taser is a powerful weapon, and we heard during that interview there's just a few days training given. Some of that training needs to be around when not to use the taser, and I think for me that's a change I'd like to see pretty quickly. Okay.